They came in the dead of night. 2 men in pressed uniforms, flashing badges under the porchlight, demanding entry. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispers spreading that the homeowner was finally being arrested. The HOA had complained for months, and now it looked as if the law had come to drag him away. But something about the scene was off. Their voices too sharp, their authority too rehearsed. The so-called officers didn't realize the man standing inside wasn't just another frightened resident. He was the chief of police. And this night, their game was about to collapse. What happens when the enforcers discover they picked the wrong house? The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost too perfect. The kind of community where every lawn stayed trimmed to regulation. Height and every house matched the next in color and design. Families waved politely, kids rode bicycles down the cul-de-sac, and on the surface it seemed like an easy place to live. But behind that polished order stood the HOA, watchful, strict and unrelenting. They enforced rules like scripture, turning even the smallest details into battles. The man at the center of this story wasn't just any homeowner. He lived quietly with his family in a modest but well-kept home, respected by neighbors who knew nothing of his true profession. To them, he was just another resident, mowing his lawn and carrying groceries from his car. But in reality, he was the chief of police, a man with decades of service, someone who had seen real crime, real danger, and had commanded officers who faced down the worst of humanity. And yet, here in this quiet neighborhood, his greatest challenge wouldn't come from criminals in dark alleys. It would come from the very association sworn to maintain peace and order. At first, it was small things. Letters slipped into his mailbox about the shade of paint on his garage trim. Warnings about a flower bed that stretched 2 inches beyond regulation. Most people would grumble, maybe pay a fine, maybe give in. But he didn't. He stood firm, quietly ignoring their petty warnings. That defiance, though harmless in his eyes, lit a fire in the board members. They weren't used to resistance. They thrived on control. And when control slipped, they schemed. Neighbors noticed the board watching his house more closely, scribbling notes at meetings, whispering about him like a criminal under surveillance. What began as irritation over rules would soon turn into something darker, something so outrageous that no one in the neighborhood could believe it was real. The HOA's warnings didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. What began with petty letters about lawn, height grew into a constant barrage of accusations. Each week, a new notice arrived, claims that his trash cans sat on the curb for minutes too long, that his mailbox paint looked non-compliant, even that his car, a spotless, regulation-approved family sedan, was parked at a slight angle. Neighbors began whispering, not because they believed the HOA's nonsense, but because they feared becoming targets themselves. The association thrived on intimidation. Most homeowners bowed their heads and paid the fines, choosing silence over trouble. But this man, he didn't flinch. Each letter went into a drawer, carefully saved, recorded, and catalogued. He wasn't just defying them. He was building a case. The HOA didn't know who they were dealing with. To them, he was just another stubborn homeowner, unwilling to play by the rules. They had no idea he was the chief of police, a man who understood law, procedure, and evidence better than anyone in the county. But their arrogance blinded them, and so their tactics grew bolder. One afternoon, while his family was sitting down for dinner, a loud knock rattled the front door. Outside stood 2 HOA board members, clipboards in hand, wearing smug expressions. They claimed they had the right to inspect his backyard for unapproved modifications. He knew better. No board member had authority to barge onto private property. Calmly, he asked them to leave. They didn't. They pressed, threatening him with fines and legal consequences. His response was simple. He shut the door. From that moment, the tension exploded. The HOA launched a full-blown campaign against him. Letters turned into certified warnings. Warnings became threats of liens. They claimed he was endangering property values and fostering hostility within the neighborhood. The words were absurd, but the intent was clear. They wanted him broken, humiliated and forced out. But the more they pushed, the calmer he remained. That only enraged them further, and soon they escalated beyond rules and fines into something more sinister. Late at night, his family noticed cars idling outside the house. Dark silhouettes sat behind the wheel, watching, taking notes. Sometimes a camera flash went off. Other times the cars crept by slowly, circling the block like predators. His wife grew anxious. His children grew fearful. He, however, stayed quiet. Every detail went into his file. Every incident was documented. But the HOA wasn't satisfied with intimidation. They wanted control, and control required breaking him publicly. That's when they devised their most outrageous plan yet. At the next board meeting, whispers spread among residents that the man was under investigation. They claimed he had violated so many community rules that law enforcement would soon get involved. A few skeptical homeowners raised eyebrows, questioning the board's authority. But the board spoke with confidence, disguising their lies as facts. And then the unbelievable happened. A week later, just as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, two men dressed in cheap, mismatched uniforms appeared at his doorstep. Their badges gleamed in the dim light, though something about them looked off. Their belts held imitation holsters, and their posture was stiff, unnatural. They introduced themselves as officers, and claimed they were there to place him under arrest for repeated HOA violations. His wife froze. His children stood wide-eyed, clutching the staircase railing. Neighbors peeked through blinds, drawn by the spectacle of flashing car headlights behind the supposed officers. The board had finally crossed a line no one thought possible. They had hired imposters, dressed as law enforcement, to publicly shame and terrify him. And in that moment, the man stayed silent. He studied the imposters, his trained eyes instantly spotting the flaws. Their uniforms weren't regulation. Their words didn't match official procedure. Their behavior screamed fraud. He knew, but he didn't act. Not yet. Instead, he allowed the scene to unfold, letting the board dig their own grave deeper. Behind the curtains, neighbors whispered, shocked at what they were seeing. Some believed it, others doubted. But all of them felt one thing: fear. If the HOA could do this to him, what chance did anyone else have? And still the impostors pressed on, demanding he step outside, threatening to detain him in front of his family. His children clung to their mother. His wife's voice trembled as she asked if this was legal, and the neighbors leaned closer, waiting for his next move. This was no longer about petty fines. This was war. But what no one knew, what not even the board realized, was that their plan had already backfired, because the man they were trying to humiliate wasn't just another homeowner. He was the chief of police, and the moment he chose to reveal the truth would become the turning point no one saw coming. The impostors thought they held the power. The HOA believed they had won. But as his eyes locked on theirs, a storm was brewing inside him, a storm that would shatter the false authority the board had built. And when it broke, it would change everything. The impostors stood on his porch, demanding he step outside. Their voices were loud enough for the entire cul-de-sac to hear. The HOA board, lurking a few houses down, watched smugly as the spectacle unfolded. Neighbors peered through their blinds, some shaking their heads, others wide-eyed with disbelief. It was the moment the HOA had been waiting for. Public humiliation. A scene designed to break the man's pride, to strip away his dignity in front of his wife, his children, and his community. But instead of fear, there was silence, a heavy, deliberate silence. The man stared at the two impostors, his eyes calm, his stance unshaken. Years of training had taught him how to read people under stress, and these men were unraveling before his very eyes. Their voices cracked slightly. Their hands trembled on their imitation belts. Their eyes darted nervously as if begging for backup. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, steady, commanding. Who authorized this arrest? The impostors exchanged glances, fumbling over their words. They muttered something about the board's request and community violations. It was nonsense, and everyone watching could feel it. The neighbors began whispering louder now, suspicion spreading like wildfire. Then, with deliberate slowness, the man reached into his jacket. His wife gasped softly, but he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for his badge. The moment the gold shield caught the porch light, the impostors froze. Their faces drained of color. The neighbors who had been watching from the shadows suddenly pressed closer to the glass, trying to get a clearer view. Gasps rippled down the street. He wasn't just a homeowner standing against the HOA. He was the chief of police. The impostors tried to backpedal, stammering excuses, claiming there had been a misunderstanding. But it was too late. His voice rose, sharp and undeniable. "You're impersonating law enforcement. That's a felony." The impostors panicked. Their composure shattered like glass. One of them tried to run. But before he could take 2 steps, real squad cars, summoned by the chief, himself minutes earlier, pulled up to the curb. Their sirens wailing, red and blue lights flooding the street. Neighbors poured onto their porches now, drawn by the chaos. The smug faces of the HOA board twisted into horror as they realized what had just happened. Their grand plan to humiliate him had backfired spectacularly, and in the worst possible way. Officers stormed the porch, handcuffing the impostors as the chief stood unmoving, watching every second with a stone-cold stare. His children, once fearful, now looked at their father with wide-eyed pride. His wife, shaking with relief, gripped his hand. The HOA president tried to step forward, his voice cracking as he attempted to spin the narrative. "This is all a misunderstanding. We were only trying to enforce community standards." But the chief cut him off. His voice thundered through the cul-de-sac like a hammer striking steel. "You hired criminals to impersonate officers. You terrorized my family. You violated the law, and every single thing you've done is documented." The crowd erupted. Neighbors who had once stayed silent finally spoke up, shouting in agreement, their pent-up frustrations spilling out. Years of petty fines, intimidation, and harassment, all of it came boiling to the surface. They weren't whispering anymore. They were shouting. The HOA board was surrounded, not by armed impostors this time, but by the angry voices of the very community they claimed to protect. The chief wasn't finished. He pulled out a thick folder, swollen with months of documentation. Letters, fines, photographs of surveillance cars, transcripts of threats. It was all there. He handed it directly to the real officers, his voice cold as stone. "Every law they've broken, every resident they've harassed, it's all in here. And tonight you'll start holding them accountable." The HOA president's face turned pale. The smug superiority evaporated. Suddenly he wasn't the enforcer, he was the accused. And the neighbors, once fearful, now stood united, glaring at him with disgust. One by one, the board members tried to slip away. But they couldn't escape the glares, the phones recording their every move, the neighbors demanding answers. What was once a quiet neighborhood had turned into a stage for their downfall, and at the center of it stood the chief, not as a victim, but as the man who had brought their empire of intimidation crashing down in one single night. The impostors were hauled into police cars, their heads hung low, their fake badges confiscated. The board members stammered, begged, tried to talk their way out of it, but the truth was undeniable. For years they had wielded fear as their weapon, but now fear had turned against them. The chief looked around at his neighbors. their eyes filled with relief and vindication. Then, in a voice calm but unshakably firm, he delivered the final blow. "This ends tonight." The words echoed through the night air, silencing the last desperate whispers of the board. And with that, the tide shifted completely. No longer were the residents under the thumb of a corrupt HOA. No longer would families live in fear of letters, fines, and intimidation. The balance of power had changed, and it would never be the same again. But as the board members stood frozen in humiliation, and as the impostors sat cuffed in the back of patrol cars, one question lingered in the minds of every neighbor watching. If the HOA could stoop this low, what else had they been hiding all along? The night of flashing lights and handcuffed impostors was only the beginning. For the neighborhood, it was a turning point. For the HOA board, it was the beginning of their downfall. And for the chief of police, the man they tried to break, it was vindication that would echo far beyond that cul-de-sac. The morning after the arrests, the neighborhood was alive with murmurs. People who had barely spoken to one another before were suddenly standing together on driveways, swapping stories of harassment, intimidation, and fines that never made sense. Neighbors who had suffered in silence now felt safe enough to come forward. One couple spoke about how the board had threatened them with foreclosure over a flower bed that didn't fit the community aesthetic. Another man revealed that he had been fined for parking his own truck in his driveway overnight, despite no such rule appearing in the bylaws. Piece by piece, the ugly truth of the HOA's reign unraveled. The chief, methodical as always, didn't waste a moment. With the folder of evidence he had already gathered, he filed formal complaints with the state attorney's office. Investigators were assigned. Subpoenas were issued. The board, once so smug and untouchable, suddenly found themselves under the magnifying glass of real authority. For the first time in years, the residents weren't receiving threatening letters. They were receiving updates on a legal case that promised to dismantle the system that had controlled them. And with every passing week, more neighbors joined the fight. Some testified. Others brought receipts, emails, and photographs. What had once been isolated stories of mistreatment became a mountain of undeniable proof. The HOA boardroom, once a place of unchecked arrogance, was now filled with fear. Members argued amongst themselves, pointing fingers, trying desperately to assign blame. The president, once the loudest voice, grew quieter with each meeting. The treasurer, who had personally signed off on legal fees and enforcement costs, found himself unable to explain where tens of thousands of dollars had disappeared. And then came the breaking point. The state filed charges: fraud, harassment, misuse of funds, conspiracy. The very laws the board claimed to uphold had been used as weapons against them. And now those same laws were closing in like iron shackles. Neighbors gathered at the courthouse on the first day of hearings. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of anger. Many came just to see justice with their own eyes. The chief didn't sit in the front row. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to remind everyone why they were there. The courtroom buzzed with tension as prosecutors laid out the evidence. The imposter officers, already arrested and facing their own sentences, testified about who had hired them and why. Emails between board members revealed discussions of teaching him a lesson and making an example out of him. Every smug remark, every arrogant decision, every abuse of power was dragged into the light for all to see. By the time the verdict came, there was no doubt left. Several board members were convicted. Others were forced to resign permanently, barred from ever serving on another association again. The HOA, once feared, was dismantled from the inside out. But the impact didn't stop there. For the community, the collapse of the corrupt HOA was like a weight lifted from their shoulders. Families decorated their yards without fear of fines. Children played in driveways without parents, worrying about citations for noise violations. Trucks parked where trucks were meant to be parked. It wasn't chaos, it was freedom. The neighborhood didn't fall apart when the rules vanished. In fact, it thrived. People painted fences, trimmed hedges, repaired homes, and planted gardens not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. For the chief and his family, the ordeal left scars, but also brought pride. His children had seen him stand tall when it mattered most. His wife had watched him protect not just their home, but the entire community. And for him, there was the satisfaction of knowing that those who had tried to weaponize fear against him had been defeated by the very law they had mocked. Neighbors began to look at him differently. He wasn't just another resident. He was the man who had faced down corruption and won. And slowly, the neighborhood shifted. Instead of suspicion and silence, there was trust and cooperation. People spoke openly. They stood up for one another. The community, once fractured, became whole again. And the HOA, its downfall became a story whispered in nearby towns, a cautionary tale for other boards who believed themselves untouchable. Word spread of how one neighborhood learned the hard way that power built on fear is fragile, and that when people stand together, even the most intimidating authority can crumble. But perhaps the most important impact wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in the way people thought about power itself. For years, the residents had believed they had no choice but to obey, that fines, threats, and intimidation were simply part of living in a nice neighborhood, that the HOA's authority was absolute. But the chief had proven otherwise. He had shown them that no authority is beyond question, that rules must serve people, not the other way around, and that standing up, even against those who seem powerful, is always worth the risk. The lesson spread far beyond that cul-de-sac. It became a reminder, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, shared online and retold in communities across the state. If your leaders abuse their power, they're not leaders at all. They're tyrants, and tyrants always fall. Months later, the chief walked down the same street where imposters had once tried to arrest him. Children waved. Neighbors greeted him warmly. The fear that once hung over the neighborhood was gone, replaced by laughter, by pride, by freedom. And though he rarely spoke about the night it all changed, one thought stayed with him every time. He looked around at the community he had fought to protect. They tried to use fear to control us, but fear doesn't win. Not when good people stand together. The HOA had thought they could break him. Instead, they had broken themselves. And so the story ends, not with a quiet return to normal life, but with a lesson carved deep into the memory of an entire neighborhood. Power without justice is nothing, and those who forget that will always, always pay the price.